The acrid smoke coiled in the air like a phantom of despair, burning Alice's throat and clawing into her lungs as she awoke in the wreckage of what had been her world. Heat roared around her, the shattered skeleton of her sod house collapsing in on itself, timbers groaning like dying giants. She struggled for breath, every inhale a battle against suffocation, every exhale a plea to live just one heartbeat longer. Yet what gripped her more than the choking air was the weight pressing down upon her chest, so heavy she thought her ribs would shatter, her heart stilling beneath the crushing timber. For a moment she believed it was the hand of fate pinning her to this fiery grave. Then she opened her eyes and saw him. Through the haze of smoke and flame, a figure loomed above her, bronze skin streaked with ash and sweat, his dark hair falling loose in wild strands. Muscles corded with strain, he braced against the massive beam that threatened to end her life, his arms trembling yet unyielding. His eyes, obsidian pools lit by the glow of the inferno, held none of the savage hunger she had been taught to fear, but instead a fierce, unrelenting determination. His breath came in labored gusts, each word forced through clenched teeth as he whispered against the roar of the fire, "Breathe with me." And in that instant, though terror clawed at her, she realized he was not her captor. He was her salvation. The flames screamed louder, devouring the remnants of her home with merciless hunger, while outside, rifle shots cracked through the night. Hooves thundered in vicious circles around the smoldering ruins, shadows of riders weaving like wolves closing in for the kill. Whoever had orchestrated this blaze would not be satisfied until her body lay among the ashes. But here, against all odds, she felt the living warmth of another shielding her, a presence so steady that even the chaos of fire and bullets could not unmake it. His hand brushed her shoulder, strong and grounding, guiding her to prepare for escape. Her cotton chemise clung to her smoke-streaked skin, leaving her vulnerable in ways beyond modesty, yet the fear of shame was nothing compared to the fear of death waiting outside the burning walls. His knife flashed like a fragment of lightning as he wedged it beneath the timber, his arms straining, his body radiating heat like a living forge. "When I say move," he ordered softly, his lips close enough that she felt his words more than heard them. "Roll hard to your left." She nodded, unable to speak, her heart pounding in a rhythm of desperation and hope. Then came the command. She rolled, lungs burning, and he heaved the beam upward with a roar of exertion. Air rushed into her chest, sharp and sweet despite the smoke, filling her starved lungs with healing relief. Strong hands pulled her clear, pressing her against the hard strength of his chest, as bullets whined through the night like vengeful spirits. She gasped, voice ragged, "Why? Why are you helping me?" His reply, steady even under fire, cut through the crackling blaze and the darkness beyond. "Because they want war between my people and yours. They will not have it tonight. Not while I draw breath." The night quaked with pursuit, torches flickering in the distance, laughter of unseen enemies rolling like cruel thunder. Yet in that moment, as he lifted her onto the broad back of his horse and swung behind her with the grace of a warrior born to the saddle, she clung to him not just for survival, but for something unspoken, something she had never expected to feel on the edge of death. His arm encircled her waist, secure and unwavering, his warmth against her trembling body carrying a quiet healing that steadied her soul. Together, they fled into the darkness, hooves pounding, sparks from gunfire flashing in the corners of her vision. Behind them, her home, her life as she had known it, crumbled into ash. Ahead, only uncertainty waited. Yet against the chaos, she held on to the single truth that steadied her. She was not alone. In the rhythm of the gallop, the whistle of wind, and the unyielding beat of his heart against her back, Alice felt the first flicker of something that made her want to keep breathing, to keep moving forward, even as the past burned away. The night had begun as an ending, but now it trembled with the fragile promise of a beginning she could not yet name. And as their flight carried them farther from ruin, a quiet flame, one not born of destruction, but of healing, trust, and unlooked-for tenderness, began to kindle between them. If this story stirs even a small spark of warmth within you, let your heart guide your hands. Leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to walk beside Alice and the warrior through each chapter of this journey. Every gesture of connection, no matter how small, helps this tale continue to unfold with healing light and hope. And so their escape through fire became not just survival, but the first step into a destiny neither of them could have foreseen, leading gently into what awaited beyond the shadows. The night opened wide before them, a vast expanse of prairie cloaked in shadow and silver starlight, every hoofbeat carrying them further from the inferno that had consumed her past. Alice clung to him, her fingers gripping the worn leather of his belt, every muscle in her trembling body straining to stay steady against the storm of pursuit. The wind lashed her face, carrying the acrid ghost of smoke still clinging to her hair and skin, yet beneath it she caught the faint scent of sage and earth from him, grounding her, steadying her heartbeat like a balm of healing in the chaos. Behind them, the shouts of men grew fainter, swallowed by the immensity of the land, though the crack of gunfire still pierced the night with ruthless persistence. His arm tightened around her waist as the horse surged forward, leaping across a shallow ravine with the strength of a creature born to endless freedom. She gasped, pressing back against him, feeling the solid wall of his chest and the steady rhythm of his breath. Even wounded, he carried himself with unyielding resolve, his strength flowing into her, as if he bore not only his own weight, but hers as well. Warmth seeped through her fear, a strange comfort in the midst of terror, like sunlight breaking through a storm. She realized then how fragile she felt, stripped of her home, her safety, and yet strangely safe here. Pressed close against this man who had every reason to leave her behind, but chose instead to shield her with his very body. A searing sting tore through the air, and she heard him inhale sharply. A bullet had found its mark, grazing his side. She felt the wet warmth of blood soaking into his shirt, smelled the copper tang mingling with sweat and smoke, and the knowledge pierced her with a grief as sharp as if the wound were her own. Yet he made no cry of pain, only urged the horse onward with the quiet discipline of someone long accustomed to carrying burdens heavier than flesh could endure. Her heart ached for him, not just for the wound, but for the silent endurance etched into every line of his body. She pressed her hand against his ribs, desperate to staunch the flow, whispering words she did not know she still carried, small fragments of prayer and comfort meant as much for herself as for him. Her touch lingered not only as aid, but as a plea. "Hold on. Don't leave me." Branches whipped across her arms as they plunged into a grove of willows by the creek, the world narrowing to shadows and the thunder of pursuit growing distant. At last he slowed the horse, guiding it through a maze of brush until they reached a clearing where the water pooled like a mirror of the night sky. The horse's sides heaved with exhaustion, steam rising from its coat, but the warrior slid down with grace, his movements taut with controlled pain. He turned, lifting Alice from the saddle as if she weighed nothing, though she felt the tremor in his body as he set her on the soft earth by the water's edge. Her legs nearly gave way, the strength drained from her, but his hand steadied her, warm and unwavering. For the first time since the fire began, silence wrapped around them, broken only by the whisper of wind through leaves and the gentle murmur of water. The violence they had fled seemed impossibly far away in this small pocket of peace. Alice sank to the ground, her lungs burning with the residue of smoke, her mind reeling with loss too vast to name. Yet before she could give way to despair, her eyes found him again. This stranger, this saviour, whose presence held back the darkness pressing at her soul. She reached for his side instinctively, drawn by the sight of blood darkening his buckskin. "Let me help," she whispered, voice raw but steady. He caught her wrist gently, his touch firm but careful, his gaze meeting hers with an intensity that felt like both command and comfort. "I've endured worse," he said softly, though the truth of his pain was etched in his face. Still, she would not relent. She pressed her torn sleeve against his wound, her hands trembling yet determined, and he let her, as though conceding not out of weakness, but respect. In that quiet act, something shifted between them, a fragile trust born not of words but of necessity, of shared breath and shared danger. Her grief and fear did not vanish, but they softened under his presence, eased by the knowledge that she was not alone. It felt like the first thread of healing woven through the jagged edges of her shattered night. The stars shimmered above them, eternal and indifferent, yet Alice felt as though they bore witness to something that belonged only to the two of them. She realized she did not even know his name, yet his heartbeat had steadied her when death reached for her. His strength had carried her through fire and storm. Names could come later. What mattered now was this quiet certainty she had never expected to feel, that their paths had crossed not by chance, but by something larger, something that made her want to keep breathing, keep fighting, keep hoping. And as the night deepened around them, she sensed that this was only the beginning, the first fragile step into a journey where love and danger, loss and healing would walk side by side. The water rippled gently, carrying away ash and blood into the current, and in that soft murmur she felt the world whisper a promise, that even after fire something new could grow. She looked at him once more, and though exhaustion weighted her eyelids, her spirit rose with a quiet strength. Whatever came next, she would face it with him. And as dawn waited somewhere beyond the horizon, their bond, though unspoken, began to take root in the fertile silence of the night. The stars had not yet faded when Alice felt the trembling in her limbs slow, her breath finding a steadier rhythm, as though the calm presence of the warrior at her side had woven invisible threads of healing through her frayed spirit. The night still carried the echo of gunfire and smoke, yet the creek's murmur soothed her, its voice like a lullaby whispered by the earth itself. She sat upon the grass, the hem of her torn chemise damp with dew, and watched as he crouched at the water's edge, rinsing blood from his side with silent stoicism. Every movement was deliberate, controlled, the bearing of a man who had long carried pain without complaint. The wound was shallow, but the crimson trail down his ribs filled her with an ache that seemed to mirror her own. She moved closer without thinking, drawn not by duty but by something deeper, something that made her heart reach toward him despite the silence that lay between them. Kneeling beside him, she took the strip of cloth he had torn from his shirt earlier and pressed it gently against the gash. His fingers brushed hers, rough from years of battle and survival, but tender in that moment, guiding her hand into place. Their eyes met in the dim light, and though neither spoke, she felt the weight of a bond forming, fragile yet strong enough to quiet the fear inside her. It was not born of gratitude alone, but of recognition. Two souls scarred by loss, finding in one another an anchor. "Wicasa," he said finally, his voice low, carrying the resonance of the earth, as though the name itself had roots in the soil. She repeated it softly, her lips shaping the sound with care, tasting the strangeness of it, yet feeling how it fit him perfectly, how it fit this moment. "Alice," she whispered when he asked hers, and his gaze softened, as if the syllables carried a kind of strength he wished to remember. Their names lingered in the night like a vow, unspoken yet understood. Beyond the willows, the faint glow of torches moved through the darkness, a reminder that danger had not retreated, but merely waited. She shivered, though the night air was gentle, and he noticed. Without hesitation, he shrugged off the remnants of his buckskin shirt and draped it across her shoulders, the fabric heavy with his warmth and scent. She wanted to protest, to remind him that he was the wounded one, but the look in his eyes silenced her. It was not an act of pride, but of care, a quiet offering that healed something inside her far more deeply than the scratch of flame across her arm. As dawn approached, pale light painted the horizon in strokes of silver and rose, casting the world in a fragile peace. Alice realized she had lost everything, the home she had built with her late husband's dreams, the soil tilled by her own hands, the safety she had clung to through lonely years. Yet sitting here beside this warrior who had risked his life for hers, she felt that not all had been taken. Something remained. The breath in her lungs, the steady rhythm of another heart close to her own, and the faint but undeniable spark of possibility. The fire had destroyed, yes, but it had also stripped away illusions, leaving her bare to truths she could no longer ignore. She was alive, and she was not alone. Her gaze lingered on Wicasa's profile as he kept watch on the thinning shadows, his presence as solid as the stones beneath the water's current. Strength radiated from him, but so did a gentleness she had not expected, a gentleness that made her chest tighten with both fear and longing. She wondered what scars lay hidden behind those quiet eyes, what griefs he carried in silence, and why he had chosen to save her when he could have turned away. The creek whispered against its banks, and in its song Alice heard the faint promise of renewal. Her own wounds throbbed, but with each heartbeat she felt them easing, soothed not only by his care, but by the unspoken assurance that she had not been left to face the ruins alone. She tilted her face toward the rising light, feeling its warmth settle on her skin like a blessing, and in that moment she knew the night had ended in fire, but the day began in healing. And between the two, bound by survival and the quiet beginnings of trust, she and Wicasa had stepped into a story larger than either could have foreseen. The horse grazed nearby, its steady breaths mingling with the sounds of water and wind, and the world felt suspended in a fragile stillness. Yet beyond that clearing lay Rock Creek, the town whose shadows stretched long and dark across both their fates. Alice sensed it even before Wicasa's gaze turned toward the east, where danger and destiny waited. She drew his shirt closer around her shoulders, feeling its weight like both protection and promise, and prepared herself to follow wherever this path would lead, knowing the next step would draw them deeper into peril and perhaps deeper into each other. Morning unfurled slowly, the pale light spilling across the prairie like a fragile blessing, softening the harsh edges of a world that had turned cruel in the span of a single night. Alice walked beside Wicasa as their horse picked a steady path along the rutted track leading toward Rock Creek. The silence between them not heavy, but alive, filled with thoughts neither could yet speak aloud. The smoke of her ruined homestead still lingered faintly on the horizon, a smear of grey against the sky, a reminder of what had been taken. Yet within her chest, something steadier began to take root, a fragile resilience, nourished by the strange companionship of the man who had saved her life. His presence was quiet strength, and in the rhythm of their shared steps she felt a gentle healing, as if every mile carried her further from despair. The land stretched wide and unbroken, wild grasses bowing beneath the wind like an ocean of green and gold. It was the same land her husband had once loved, had worked himself into an early grave for, believing it would bear them a future. Now she looked at it with new eyes, and she wondered if the fire had not only stolen her home, but also stripped away the last remnants of the life she had clung to in grief. She was untethered, yet she did not drift alone. Beside her, Wicasa carried himself with a warrior's poise, his movements precise even in weariness, his gaze alert to every sound and shadow. She watched him from the corner of her eye and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the rising sun, a sense of safety she had not known in years. By the time Rock Creek came into view, the town lay quiet beneath the heat of late morning. Wooden buildings squatted along the dusty main street like weary sentinels, their false fronts painted bright but concealing interiors weathered by hardship. The air smelled of horse sweat, coal smoke, and the faint tang of whiskey drifting from the saloon. To Alice, it was a familiar sight, one she had grown used to during her weekly trips with eggs and vegetables, yet today the town seemed altered, as though the shadows clinging to its corners had deepened overnight. Wicasa's expression hardened as they approached, his eyes narrowing not in fear, but in recognition of danger woven into the very fabric of the place. She remembered the first time she had seen Deputy Vernon Slate stalking down this same street, his spurs ringing a cold rhythm against the packed earth. He was the kind of man who smiled without warmth, whose gaze slid over women like a knife measuring where best to cut. He had spoken to her in that false friendly tone, asking after her claim, his pale eyes never leaving her face. Beneath his politeness had been something darker, a promise of power misused, a reminder that men like him carried not only guns, but the law itself, twisted to serve their masters. That master was Thaddeus Blackwood, whose bank rose above the street like a monument to greed, its polished brick and golden letters proclaiming his dominion. As she walked now, the memory of Slate's words returned to her with chilling clarity. Dreams don't deflect bullets. Determination won't extinguish fire. And she saw how neatly those words had been fulfilled in the flames that had consumed her home. She looked at Wicasa and knew instinctively that he understood more than she had dared to imagine. His people had suffered the weight of false accusations, their lives stolen by the very men who claimed to bring order. He moved through the street with quiet defiance, a man marked as outsider, yet walking with dignity none could strip from him. The sight filled her with both pride and sorrow, as if the injustice that bound him to her fate had also carved a path between their souls. Their steps carried them past Murphy's General Store, past the schoolhouse where Miss Serenity Walsh stood in the doorway, her chin high, her dark skirts snapping in the wind. Serenity's gaze caught Alice's, and in her eyes burned the same fire that had once emboldened Alice in quieter days, a refusal to yield to men like Slate. The teacher's presence felt like a hand laid gently against Alice's heart, reminding her that she was not as alone as fear whispered. Healing often came not in grand gestures, but in the quiet knowledge of allies standing unseen, waiting for the moment to shield one another. The street shifted when Slate appeared, his badge catching the sunlight, his smile sharp as broken glass. He greeted Alice with mock courtesy, his pale eyes sliding past her to rest on Wicasa with thinly veiled contempt. The silence that followed was charged, brittle as dry timber ready to snap. Alice felt the old fear crawl at her spine, but then she sensed Wicasa beside her, unmoved, unshaken, the stillness of a mountain against the storm. She drew strength from it, inhaled, and met Slate's gaze with steady defiance. The tremor in her chest quieted, replaced by something stronger, a quiet flame of resolve that even the deputy's sneer could not extinguish. Across the street, the polished doors of Blackwood's bank opened, and the man himself emerged. Thaddeus Blackwood carried the weight of power in his stride, his silver hair gleaming, his eyes calculating, predatory. He tipped his hat with a smile that carried no warmth, speaking with words that dripped like honey but stung like poison. He offered her a way out, a chance to sell what remained of her claim, to abandon the ashes of her life for the comfort of coin. His tone was paternal, almost gentle, yet beneath it pulsed the quiet cruelty of a man who had orchestrated every accident that drove settlers from their land. Alice listened, her stomach tight with disgust, and when she refused him, she saw his smile sharpen into something colder, a storm gathering behind his gaze. She realized then that the fire which had nearly consumed her was not the end, but the beginning. What had been taken from her was part of a far greater scheme, one designed to break not only her, but every family in the valley. The thought might have crushed her had she been alone, but as Blackwood's shadow stretched long across the street, she felt Wicasa's steady presence beside her, a reminder that she was no longer standing on scorched ground by herself. Something deeper than chance had brought them together, and though the path ahead would be filled with peril, she sensed that healing could also grow there, fragile but alive. When they turned away from the bank, leaving behind the weight of Blackwood's false pleasantries, Alice knew the fight had only begun. Yet even as dread whispered of coming trials, she felt the threads of connection. Serenity's fierce gaze, the quiet promise of Amos Fletcher's neighborly loyalty, and above all, the strength of the man walking at her side. The sun glared bright overhead, but its light carried something more than heat. It carried hope, faint but steady. Alice breathed deeply, holding to that warmth, and prepared to step into whatever shadows awaited them next, knowing the story unfolding was no longer hers alone, but theirs together. The days that followed unfolded with a deceptive calm, as though the world itself conspired to hide the storm gathering at the edges of Rock Creek. Alice rose each morning with the ache of loss still sharp inside her, but also with the steadying presence of Wicasa never far from reach. Together they walked the scorched remains of her homestead, and though grief rose in her chest with each blackened timber and shattered stone, she felt the comfort of his silence, his gaze upon the ruins carrying neither pity nor dismissal, but a quiet acknowledgment of her pain. That unspoken recognition healed her more than words ever could, reminding her that wounds, when shared, became lighter to bear. Neighbors began to drift toward her land, drawn by whispers of what had happened, and by something rarer still, an unspoken alliance forming against the men who thought fear could scatter them like chaff in the wind. Amos Fletcher was the first to appear, his weathered frame outlined by morning light, hat in hand, eyes heavy with worry, yet bright with quiet resolve. He offered to mend her fences, to stand watch at her side, his voice carrying the simple weight of sincerity. "Good fences make good neighbors," he said, but Alice heard more beneath the words. A vow that she would not be left alone to face the fire again. She accepted with gratitude, her heart easing in ways she hadn't thought possible. Wicasa's eyes lingered on Amos, measuring, then softened with the faintest nod, as though acknowledging the man's loyalty as a bond worth trusting. Serenity Walsh, fierce as ever, walked out from the schoolhouse the following day, her skirts snapping in the wind like a banner of defiance. She pressed Alice's hands in hers, her voice quiet but firm, telling her she was not forgotten, not forsaken. The touch of friendship felt like water poured onto parched earth, soaking into the cracks of loneliness that had long lived in Alice's soul. Healing often came this way, in small gestures, steady as the turning of the seasons, building strength in silence. With Serenity's gaze upon her, Alice felt a quiet courage stir, a reminder that even amid ruin, she was still a woman of worth, of resilience, of hope. Yet, beneath these small kindnesses, darker currents moved unseen. Deputy Slate's pale eyes followed her whenever she ventured into town, his smile carrying the weight of unspoken threats. More than once, Alice caught him standing idly near her wagon, his hand brushing the butt of his revolver as if to remind her of the power he carried. His words were subtle, veiled in false courtesy, but she heard the steel beneath them. And always behind Slate stood the looming shadow of Blackwood, the man who seemed to own not just the buildings, but the very breath of Rock Creek. His offers to buy her land, cloaked in civility, hung heavy in her memory, the polished mask of greed hiding fangs beneath. At night, when the prairie stretched silent beneath the stars, Alice would sit near the creek with Wicasa. The water's gentle murmur calmed the restlessness inside her, and beside him she felt her strength return in ways she hadn't known she'd lost. Sometimes they spoke, their words weaving fragments of their lives together, the husband she had buried, the sister he had left behind, the pain of loss, the fragile joy of endurance. Other times they sat in silence, the space between them filled with something warmer than speech, something that healed by simply existing. The rhythm of his breathing, steady and deep, became a comfort she leaned into, and though she dared not name it, she felt the first tender stirring of trust softening the raw edges of her heart. But peace is a fragile thing on the frontier, easily shattered by greed and malice. Amos returned one evening, his face lined with worry, his voice urgent. He told Alice what his brother had seen at Fire Creek: barrels of coal oil stacked in secret, feathers and paint stored for false raids, plans drawn to ignite fear and turn neighbor against neighbor. As his words sank in, Alice felt her blood chill with certainty. Wicasa had been right all along. The fires that had consumed her life were no accident of chance. They were part of a careful, ruthless design. Her homestead, her grief, had been nothing more than a move in a game orchestrated by men who thought themselves untouchable. She looked at Wicasa then, and their eyes met in the dimming light. No words were needed. Between them passed the same truth. They stood at the edge of something larger than either of their lives, a battle not only for land, but for dignity, justice, and the fragile threads of peace that still held this valley together. In his gaze she saw determination tempered by sorrow, the weight of generations carried quietly in his shoulders, and in hers he seemed to find something that steadied him in return, a woman stripped of everything but unwilling to yield, her strength rooted not in power but in perseverance. The prairie night wrapped around them, stars burning bright overhead, and the air carried a stillness that felt like the deep inhale before a storm. Alice knew the days ahead would demand more than she had ever given, but with Amos's loyalty, Serenity's courage, and Wicasa's steady presence, she felt her spirit knit itself together again. Healing was never sudden, never complete, but it was alive in her now, fragile, yet unbreakable. She touched the warrior's hand in the darkness, not in boldness, but in quiet gratitude. And for a moment the fear lifted, replaced by warmth that spread through her like firelight after cold. When she closed her eyes that night, the memory of her burning home still haunted her, but so too did the feeling of his hand steady against hers, the sound of the creek whispering of renewal, and the promise that even amid ruin, new beginnings could be born. And when dawn came, she knew she would rise not only to face the shadows of Rock Creek, but to walk forward into whatever lay ahead, with him. Night came heavy, cloaked in silence, broken only by the restless calls of owls and the sigh of wind through the prairie grass. Alice sat by the window of Amos's small cabin where they had sought shelter, her book lying forgotten in her lap, her heart too restless to be soothed by printed words. The memory of her chickens shrieking in the flames, of the rifle shots that splintered her doorway, returned with a force that set her body trembling. Every rustle outside made her start, every shift in the fire's glow painted shadows that seemed to move with intent. She knew the danger was not past. It lingered beyond the walls like a predator waiting its hour. The first warning came not from her ears, but from her skin. The sharp odor of coal oil seeped into the air, unmistakable and cruel, filling her with dread so deep it froze her breath. She rose, crossing to the window with trembling hands, and there, through the glass, she saw orange light begin to flicker against the darkness. Torches, riders, shadows adorned with feathers and paint, crude costumes meant to deceive those who did not look closely. Her heart clenched, for she knew this was no true war party, but another false raid, staged to ignite hatred and fear. And tonight it was her life they had come to finish. Before she could cry out, a rifle cracked, splintering the wooden frame of the door. Shards of timber rained around her, and the bitter truth struck hard. There would be no reasoning, no mercy. They had come to burn her alive. She seized her late husband's rifle, its weight both familiar and foreign, and levelled it at the nearest rider visible in the torchlight. The shot thundered in the night, and she saw him tumble from his saddle, a grim satisfaction searing through her fear. But for everyone who fell, more appeared, circling, splashing coal oil against the walls, their laughter a cruel chorus. Flames licked upward, catching the roof, turning her refuge into a pyre. A beam crashed down, searing sparks, scattering like shooting stars, and smoke filled her lungs, choking every breath. She turned for the back door, but fire had claimed it, trapping her in a prison of light and heat. The rifle grew slick in her hands, her vision blurred with tears and smoke, her knees weak with the weight of despair. She stumbled as another timber gave way, crushing her to the floor, pinning her beneath it. The world narrowed to fire and pain, her body unable to rise, her spirit trembling on the brink of surrender. She thought of her husband then, of the promise he had whispered on their first night beneath this roof, that the land would keep her safe. But the land had betrayed her, or so it seemed, and she lay gasping, waiting for the flames to consume what little remained. Then, through the roar of fire and the pounding of hooves, there was movement, sudden and fierce. A voice cut through the smoke, commanding her to breathe, to hold on, to fight. The weight of the beam lifted just enough, strong hands pulling her free. Her lungs drank in air that stung, yet gave life, and she found herself against the chest she now knew so well, the heartbeat of the man who had already carried her once from the edge of death. Wikasa's face loomed above her. Sweat and ash streaked across his skin, his eyes dark with both fury and resolve. He was wounded. She could see the red along his side, but he bore her weight without hesitation, his body a wall against both flame and bullet. Gunfire erupted again outside, cruel voices shouting as the horse whinnied in panic. But within that chaos there was also a stillness, a pocket of safety in his arms. He guided her toward the breach in the burning wall, every step sure, every breath carrying a command to live. The blaze screamed, beams falling like giants around them, yet through it all she felt not terror, but a strange calm, as if his presence itself were healing her, knitting her will back together with invisible thread. She pressed against him, clinging to his strength, whispering words, half prayer, half promise. Not tonight. Not like this. They burst free into the night air, the cool wind slapping her face, stars wheeling above in stark contrast to the inferno left behind. She coughed, her throat raw, but she was alive. He set her upon the horse once more, vaulting behind her with the grace of someone born to battle, and urged the animal forward into the darkness. Bullets hissed past like angry hornets, yet his arm around her waist never faltered, steady and unyielding. She felt the warmth of his breath against her hair, the iron control in his body despite the blood soaking his shirt, and her heart broke with both fear and awe. As the horse plunged through the shadows toward the safety of the riverbank, Alice knew this night had carved itself into her soul. She had lost her home, her refuge, and perhaps even her illusions of safety, but she had not lost everything. She still had breath. She still had the strength of his hand steady at her side, and she still carried the fragile but living spark of hope. The fire had tried to consume her, but from its ashes something new had been born. A bond forged in danger, sealed by trust, and warmed by the unspoken promise of healing that passed between her and the man who refused to let her fall. The river whispered ahead, its silver path gleaming beneath the moon, and she leaned back into him, letting his heartbeat guide her as they fled the blaze. Behind them, the cabin burned to embers, but before them lay the uncertain trail into dawn, carrying them both toward a fate neither could escape, and perhaps, if grace allowed, toward love. Dawn broke pale and hesitant, washing the valley in silver light that seemed too delicate for the weight of what had passed. Alice stirred against the steady rhythm of Wikasa's heartbeat, her body still trembling from smoke and exhaustion, yet soothed by the warmth of his arm around her as they rested by the river's edge. She had not slept so much as drifted in and out of shallow dreams, haunted by fire, but tethered to reality by the feel of his presence near her. Each time her lungs seized with memory of smoke, his voice, soft and calm, called her back, each word like a healing thread, weaving her frayed spirit whole again. When she opened her eyes at last, the creek whispered quietly, carrying away the last ashes of terror, leaving only the fragile pulse of life. Wikasa crouched near the water, rinsing his hands, the sunrise gilding his features with light. His wound still bled faintly, but he bore it without complaint, his movements careful yet strong. Alice watched him with a mixture of awe and worry, her heart aching with gratitude she could not shape into words. She approached him, kneeling at his side, her fingers brushing the damp cloth pressed against his ribs. "Let me," she murmured, her voice unsteady but insistent. He glanced at her, the corners of his mouth hinting at resistance, but something in her gaze softened his reluctance. He allowed her touch, allowed her care, and in that yielding she felt a bond deepen, an unspoken trust given freely, fragile but real. As she tied the bandage tighter, her hand lingered, not out of necessity, but out of a need to anchor herself to him, to remind herself that he was flesh and blood, not a dream conjured in desperation. "Why risk it?" she whispered at last, eyes fixed on the wound her hands tended. "You could have kept riding when you saw the fire. You could have left me." Her words trembled, carrying not accusation, but wonder. His silence stretched, long enough that the wind through the willows seemed to answer in his place. Then his voice came low and even, filled with quiet conviction. "Because I've seen what happens when good people stand aside and let evil grow. I've seen villages burned, lives torn apart, and I swore not to let fear decide for me again. That night, it was a time to stand." His words sank into her heart like rain into parched soil, softening something inside her she hadn't realized had hardened. She looked at him, her throat tight, and in his dark eyes she saw more than strength. She saw sorrow, loss, and a fierce determination to build something better out of ruin. They lingered there until the sun rose higher, the world around them brightening with deceptive peace. But shadows lingered in Rock Creek, and Alice knew their respite was only a breath between storms. When they rode back toward town, the streets seemed sharper, the gazes of neighbors more wary, as if the flames that had devoured her home had left a mark on the entire valley. Deputy Slate's eyes followed her again, cold and calculating, his smile twisting like a blade hidden in cloth. Yet Alice walked straighter, her chin high, no longer a woman cowering in fear. She felt Wikasa's steady presence beside her, and it gave her the courage to meet Slate's gaze with quiet defiance. Inside the doctor's modest office, Dr. Felicity Morrison examined them with practiced hands, her brow furrowed in concern, yet her voice steady, a balm in itself. "You'll heal," she assured, her fingers gentle against Alice's bruised ribs, her bandages firm yet comforting. "But healing isn't only of the body, it is of the spirit, too. Rest when you can, lean when you must." Her words carried not just medical wisdom, but truth, a reminder Alice clung to. In those moments, with the doctor's steady presence and Wikasa's watchful gaze, Alice felt the fragile beginnings of a circle forming around her, thin as thread, yet strong enough to hold back despair. As dusk fell again, Alice sat outside the small cabin lent to her by a neighbor, watching the prairie stretch endlessly beneath a sky painted in hues of rose and gold. Wikasa joined her, his movements quiet, his silhouette etched against the fading light. For a long while they said nothing, the silence between them more eloquent than words. The air was cool, scented with earth and wildflowers, carrying a sense of renewal that settled gently upon her shoulders. She turned to him, and he met her gaze, and in that shared look she felt her spirit calm, her heart steady. She realized then that love, the kind that healed rather than consumed, was not born in grand gestures or whispered promises, but in these quiet moments of presence. Two souls, scarred by fire and grief, choosing to sit together in the fading light, unafraid of what shadows might come. When the stars appeared one by one, she leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. His arm encircled her, protective yet gentle, and she let her eyes close, breathing in the warmth of him, the healing strength that seemed to flow simply from being near. She did not know what tomorrow would bring. The schemes of Blackwood, the threats of Slate, the endless hunger of men who sought to own what should never be owned. But tonight she knew this truth. She was not alone, and in that knowledge lay a power greater than fear. The world could burn again, men could rise with cruelty and lies, but as long as she had this bond, this presence, this fragile yet unyielding connection, she would endure. And when morning came, she would rise beside him, ready to face whatever awaited in the valley's shadows. The night of blood and fire gave way to days that seemed almost unreal in their stillness. Federal marshals had come, sweeping through Fire Creek like a cleansing storm, and with them went the reign of Thaddeus Blackwood. His ledgers, heavy with ink and secrets, had been pulled from the iron belly of his safe, each page a nail in the coffin of his empire. Men who had once walked tall under his command now shuffled in chains, their swagger replaced with downcast eyes. Deputy Slate, pale and trembling, had been carried off with a bullet in his shoulder, muttering curses that the wind scattered like worthless dust. For the first time in months, perhaps years, Rock Creek breathed freely, as though the valley itself sighed with relief. Alice stood at the river's edge, watching the current carry away scraps of ash and torn paper, the remnants of the world that had nearly destroyed her. The morning sun painted the water in strokes of gold, and in its shimmer she felt her soul quiet. Wikasa stepped beside her, silent as always, but his presence wrapped around her more firmly than any embrace. His wound had begun to heal. The angry red softened under Dr. Morrison's careful hands and Alice's own clumsy but devoted tending. Each night she had pressed clean cloth to his side. Each night her fingers lingered longer than necessity demanded, until the act of care itself became something deeper, a silent vow that she would never again let him carry pain alone. He had spoken little of the trial to come, or of what future might unfold for his people once the reservation was promised and protected, yet Alice knew the weight he carried. She saw it in his eyes when he looked to the horizon, saw it in the scars across his chest when he removed his shirt by the creek, each mark a testament to battles fought not just for survival, but for dignity. And though his life and hers had begun on paths that should never have crossed, she felt with a certainty that frightened her that those paths had converged with purpose. She had lost her home, but perhaps she had found something far greater. A partner forged in fire, a bond sealed not by chance, but by something higher, something eternal. The valley slowly began to heal. Families who had fled returned, guided back by the safety of federal law and the knowledge that Blackwood's hand could no longer reach them. Children's laughter once more floated on the air, mixing with the lowing of cattle and the ring of hammers as fences and roofs were repaired. The earth, scarred but not defeated, yielded green again after the rains came, and Alice found herself planting once more, pressing seeds into soil with hands that trembled not from fear but from hope. She would rebuild, she told herself, not as she had before, clinging to the memory of her husband, but anew, with her own strength, with the quiet support of the man who never asked but always stood near. On cool evenings, when the work was done, she and Wicasa sat together on the porch of the cabin she had begun to call home again. He carved small tokens of wood with his knife, birds, horses, once even a delicate flower, and left them by her window as though shy to admit they were gifts. She, in turn, stitched his torn buckskin, her needle pulling threads as steady as her heart grew when she looked at him. Words were few, yet everything that needed saying lived in the spaces between them. The silence was no longer emptiness, it was peace, it was healing, it was love spoken without voice. One night, as the stars spilled across the dark sky like scattered diamonds, Alice rested her head against his shoulder. The weight of her grief, though still present, no longer crushed her. Instead, it had shaped her into someone stronger, someone who could stand not just for herself, but for those who had no voice. And as she breathed in the warmth of Wicasa's nearness, she knew that what had begun as a desperate escape had become a story of beginning again. Fire had taken much, but love, quiet, steadfast, born of survival and trust, had given her back more than she thought she could ever hold. Her fingers found his hand in the dark, calloused and steady, and for the first time since the flames had stolen her home, she whispered, "I'm not afraid anymore." He did not answer with words. Instead, his thumb brushed over her knuckles, a simple gesture that carried the weight of a lifetime. And in that moment, under the stars and by the whispering creek, Alice understood that healing was not an ending, but a journey, one she would walk with him for as long as breath remained in her. If this story has warmed your heart, if it has offered you even a small light of healing in your own darkness, let your voice join ours. Like this tale, share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe so you may walk with Alice and Wicasa through every step of their journey. Each word you leave, each gesture of support, is a flame that keeps this story alive. Your presence matters, and together we carry hope forward.